Eddie Van Halen changed the way people thought about the electric guitar. He inspired a generation of players and turned rock music on its head. But behind that famous grin and those impossible solos, there was a quieter story, a string of tense, complicated relationships with the very guitarists he grew up worshiping. This is the story of 6 players who left a mark on Eddie, through admiration, rejection, rivalry, or all 3 at once. Long before Van Halen existed, a young Eddie sat in his bedroom in Pasadena wearing out his Cream records. He'd play Crossroads over and over, trying to lift every note Clapton had played. Clapton wasn't just a musical influence. He was the whole reason Eddie started playing guitar in the first place. Eddie later said Clapton had been his main hero growing up, someone he treated almost like a god, replaying his solos note for note just to understand what made them work. Everything changed once Van Halen broke through. Eddie's tapping, his dive bombs, his whole approach to the instrument felt like it came from nowhere, and suddenly the shy kid from Pasadena was the biggest thing in rock guitar. Not everyone was impressed, though. Asked about Van Halen in 1980, Clapton reportedly said Eddie was technically skilled, but lacking in soul. It was an offhand comment, but for Eddie it landed like a gut punch. The man who'd shaped his entire style, now seemed to be dismissing his music as cold and mechanical. Eddie admitted later that it genuinely hurt. He'd never been trying to outplay Clapton, only to honor him. He never fired back publicly. Friends say he simply carried the disappointment quietly. Some of the tension came down to 2 completely different philosophies: Clapton's blues-rooted restraint versus Eddie's all-out sonic experimentation. One represented the 60s, the other represented whatever came next. Still, Eddie's respect for Clapton's playing never really faded. Years later, he'd still call Clapton's tone on Crossroads untouchable, pure feeling that couldn't be faked. The 2 eventually crossed paths in Los Angeles in the mid-'80s. Eddie was hopeful, almost starstruck, but Clapton stayed polite and distant, sticking to small talk about gear rather than anything deeper. Afterward, Eddie told a friend he thought he'd love the myth of the man more than the man himself. It was a turning point for him. The moment he stopped putting his heroes on pedestals and started seeing them as flawed people. Years later, when asked if the old comments still bothered him, Eddie just laughed it off, joking that maybe they were simply from different planets. After Eddie passed away in 2020, Clapton reportedly spoke of him warmly in private, calling him a genuine innovator. By then, Eddie had already made peace with it, having said that without Clapton, he wouldn't exist either, and that whatever Clapton thought of him didn't change that debt. Meeting your hero rarely goes the way you imagine, and Eddie found that out the hard way with Ritchie Blackmore, the enigmatic guitarist behind Deep Purple and Rainbow. As a teenager, Eddie treated songs like Burn and Highway Star as scripture, practicing until his fingers bled. Blackmore's tone and dramatic phrasing made a huge impression on him. By 1978, Van Halen's debut had exploded, and Eddie suddenly found himself standing among the very players he'd idolized. But when he finally met Blackmore, the reception was ice cold. Eddie recalled Blackmore simply staring at him without a word of greeting, no hello, nothing, and admitted it crushed him. He wasn't an arrogant person. He loved talking gear and jamming with anyone. What stuck with him about Blackmore was that total absence of warmth. Some of that, it seems, was just Blackmore's personality. He was famously distant even with his own bandmates. When asked about Van Halen, Blackmore offered a backhanded compliment, saying Eddie was technically fine but played too many notes. Fans debated for years whether there was jealousy or old-school snobbery, but it really reflected a generational split. Blackmore's classically influenced discipline against Eddie's explosive, unbound style. Eddie never let the coldness curdle into real bitterness. Looking back in the mid-'90s, he wondered if he'd simply been too sensitive or if Blackmore had just been shy, but insisted he'd worshipped the guy growing up and still did. Blackmore eventually softened too, telling a magazine in 2008 that what Eddie did with the whammy bar and tapping was genuinely clever, and that he'd found his own voice. It was the acknowledgement Eddie had quietly wanted all along. By the time Eddie died in 2020, Even devoted Blackmore fans understood their hero had ultimately admitted Eddie found something nobody else had managed to find. In 1978, Van Halen was rewriting the rulebook while still touring as the New Kids, trying to earn their place among rock's guitar gods. On stage, a 23-year-old Eddie played like his life depended on it. Off stage, though, he kept running into the same cold shoulder, this time from Aerosmith's Joe Perry. Eddie described guys like Perry giving him the shaft with their eyes. No hello, no warmth, nothing. For a young player who idolized these musicians, it stung to be treated like a stranger. Eddie's read on it was straightforward. Players like Perry and Blackmore felt threatened by what he represented. His fluid, invention-driven style was pulling the map of rock guitar in a completely new direction, away from the riff-heavy, blues swagger tradition Perry's generation had built. To some of the veterans, it must have felt less like evolution and more like an invasion. Eddie never confronted anyone about it publicly, but privately it bothered him. He wasn't looking for mentorship, just basic respect. Still, resentment was never really his default setting. He famously said he'd happily play a random lounge gig because he simply loved playing, full stop. That attitude outlasted the sting. Years later, Perry did a complete about-face, telling an interviewer that Eddie's playing was phenomenal, that he'd taken everything he'd absorbed and made it entirely his own, and that hearing Van Halen's debut for the first time had blown him away. It came too late to erase the old hurt, but confirmed just how far Eddie's influence had traveled. And Eddie, for his part, never stopped crediting the earlier generation with making him want to play. One afternoon in the late 70s, Van Halen shared a bill with Boston, both riding the wave of America's new rock sound. Eddie had just torn through a solo when Tom Scholz walked on stage next, and, according to Eddie, proceeded to play Eddie's own solo back to the crowd. Eddie remembered standing there, more than a little drunk, watching the audience stare at him in confusion and getting genuinely angry. Some fans read it as tribute. Eddie read it as theft, not of notes, but of identity. What made it worse was that Scholz wasn't exactly approachable backstage either. Eddie described him as someone who showed up, played, and vanished without ever saying hello. Scholz, meanwhile, was almost Eddie's opposite, an MIT-trained engineer who built his own gear and recorded Boston's debut in his basement, obsessing over precision the way Eddie obsessed over feel. One trusted instinct, the other trusted formulas. Yet both were chasing the same ideal of a perfect sound. Eddie hinted at his frustration in interviews without naming Scholz directly, saying it was flattering when people copied his tapping and runs, but that they ought to find their own thing eventually. To him, originality wasn't optional. He'd built his famous Frankenstrat with his own hands, and watching someone mirror his sound felt like watching a stranger wear his face. Scholz never addressed the story publicly. He was famously private and let his gear do the talking. Eventually, some grudging mutual respect surfaced. Scholz once acknowledged Eddie's imagination couldn't be taught, and Eddie later admitted he respected anyone willing to build their own equipment. Asked later whether it bothered him that others copied his style, Eddie shrugged it off, confident that nobody could ever really sound like him. Of all the friction on this list, the clash with veteran guitarist Rick Derringer hit Eddie the hardest. In 1978, with Van Halen's debut exploding, Derringer was booked to open some shows, a player Eddie had genuinely grown up admiring. Then, according to Eddie, Derringer began playing his solos back to him, note for note, night after night, even closing with the same song Van Halen had turned into a live anthem. Eddie confronted him directly in a bar after one show, telling him he could use the same techniques, but not steal his actual melodies. When it happened again the next night, Eddie gave an ultimatum: stop, or you're off the tour. Derringer was pulled from the run shortly after. For Eddie, this wasn't really about ego. It was about identity at a moment when Van Halen was still fighting to establish its place in music history. Years later, he admitted the irony wasn't lost on him, since he'd copied some of Derringer's own licks earlier in his career. What stung wasn't imitation itself, but watching someone he respected cross that particular line. His father, a jazz musician, had taught him early on that if you're going to play someone else's song, you make it your own, and that principle stuck with Eddie for the rest of his life. Even in anger, he kept things civil. No public feud, no insults, just a firm boundary. Looking back decades later, he could laugh about how heated he'd gotten as a kid protecting a sound he'd worked so hard to build. Derringer, for his part, never fully confirmed or denied the story, but later called Eddie an untouchable player, maybe his own quiet way of making peace. The most complicated relationship on this list wasn't built on dislike so much as pride, competition, and the fear of being overshadowed. In the early 80s, Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads were the two guitarists everyone compared to each other. And for Eddie, those comparisons cut close to the bone. In archived interview audio, Eddie acknowledged Rhoads' talent, while pointedly noting that Rhoads himself had said everything he played he'd learned from Eddie, and that nothing Rhoads did was anything Eddie hadn't already done. It read as part compliment, part reassertion of ownership over the revolution he felt he'd started. Rhoads came from an entirely different background. Classically trained, disciplined, methodical, the opposite of Eddie's instinct-driven fire. Together, they became rock's two poles, chaos versus control, and the press couldn't resist pitting them against each other. Ozzy Osbourne, who worked closely with Rhoads, later pushed back hard on Eddie's version of events, saying he'd never heard Rhoads credit Eddie that way, and suggesting instead that the two had simply been rivals, whatever falling out may have happened between them. There's even a story that Rhoads' guitar tech taped a photo of Eddie to the bottom of Rhoads while pedal. Half joke, half symbol, since every time Rhoads stepped on it, he was quite literally stepping on Eddie. It was playful, but it said something real. Rhoads wanted his own legacy, yet Eddie's shadow followed him everywhere. Underneath the tension was something more human than ego. A guitarist who transformed the language of rock suddenly hearing that same language echoed back at him by a serious rival. Randy Rhoads died in a plane crash in 1982, freezing that rivalry in place forever. He never got the chance to grow past the comparisons, and Eddie never got the chance to resolve his complicated feelings about him. In later years, Eddie's tones softened